Well, MPs were told today by the Department for Transport that the government does not know how much HS2 will cost. HS2 Limited has provided a cost estimate of £55 to £66 billion in 2019 prices, but Dame Bernadette Kelly, Secretary at the Department for Transport, added that this amount should not be regarded as reliable. HS2 boss Mark Wilde also defended spending £100 million on what has been described as a batshed. You might call it wild expenditure. How has HS2 spending spiralled out of control, and do taxpayers deserve clarity on where their money is being spent? Well, joining me now is a former HS2 Limited employee and whistleblower, Andrew Bruce. Andrew, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Tell me about some of the problems you found when you were working at HS2.
One of the particular problems I found was we had two sets of figures. We had the honest set of figures, data that was created by very expensive agencies looking at individual properties, how much they would cost, how many, when we would need them. And we had the spin. The spin was there was a budget. It was a very low budget, 1.6 billion. And the data told us that actually we'd need 4.8 billion, 3 times as much money.
And this was the money needed for compulsory purchase of properties and land that was on the route of HS2.
That's absolutely correct. And it was important to get the right amount of money at the beginning. If you didn't have the right amount of money, how could you pay the landowners the true value of their properties? Something that's become a real problem.
And who knew about the two sets of figures?
It was cultural across the entire board. So it started with the Director of Land and Property, the Commercial Director, the Chief Executive Officer, the Non-Executive Board. But I also sat next to senior members of the Department for Transport. There wasn't a single senior person within HS2, and it wasn't just land and property, it was across every directorate.
And when was this? Which years were you doing this?
So I started in 2015, I left in 2016, but that was crucial. HS2 had not been voted for approval. No money had been voted across. That was the critical time where HS2 told Parliament that they could build the entire railway for a particular price with a 95% probability and get an extremely good benefit.
And did ministers know at the time, or were the civil servants not passing this on to ministers, or were ministers not paying attention to their brief?
So the senior civil servants told us that they were passing on false information to the ministers.
And let me just really understand this. So there was a budget. The budget was agreed departmentally. It was agreed with the Treasury. And then there were the estate agent's estimates that said if you buy 10 houses, it costs this much, which was 4 times the budget.
Correct. The way the estimate was first put together was early in the part of HS2. And they were only looking at a 25 square kilometre corridor, 140 miles long, 120 metres wide. What they actually required, however, and they estimated that, I think they estimated it quite correctly, that's what created the budget. However, a few months later, they realised that they'd undervalued by £1.2 billion on that 25 square kilometres. But a few months later, they also realised they needed another 45 square kilometres that was never budgeted, but they never increased.
So the budgeting for that area wasn't done on a pro rata basis for the rest of the site. Was this because of the extra space you needed to build, or was it because extra compensation was being given to people living near the proposed route?
It's a little bit of both, but I would also say that people from the estimating department knew how much the government were prepared to accept in the way of costs for HS2. And that was about £50 billion, as long as there was about 2.5 times as much benefit to be given. When it became clear that they'd need more, there was a deliberate policy. Now, it was a corrupt policy. I believe it's a fraudulent policy not to carry out any
fraud
more
is a
estimates.
strong allegation, and HS2 isn't here to defend itself. We've got a little bit careful of the language. If we just stick to the facts, if we may, because I think that's very informative for people who are viewing. And it's trying to understand how this happened, because there was political pressure from MPs who had constituencies along the route to ensure that compensation was generous to people's houses were being knocked down. Was that part of it, or were these on routine, ordinary valuations without any line being built, without any excess for the inconvenience being caused?
No, the issue was over 5,400 properties, 45 square kilometres, were never valued. No one ever looked at them. They were never added.
And at this point, no cash was going out, was it? This was the estimate before getting parliamentary approval, and the cash starts going out when they start buying the properties to bulldoze them.
That's correct. And I think initially what happened was, there's evidence of this afterwards, properties were undervalued, people were given less money than the properties were really worth. And the way we know this is because people then went to the land tribunal and the true values came out and they were paid substantially larger sums. However, people who didn't have lawyers or the money to go to land tribunal had to settle in what they were offered.
And so how did this work as the calculations were being done? Calculations were being done for the lower figure. On what basis? Who was advising on that? Or was the budget just picked out of the air to say, we can afford £1.5 billion or thereabouts, that's the figure, it can't go over this?
Yeah, so I was told by senior executives when I was given the budget. When I first arrived, the budget was held in a different department, I was given it. I was told that the government would accept a budget of £2.8 billion for land and property. That had to have a contingency of about 37% or thereabouts. That meant that 1.6 billion. So at that time, the estimate was much higher than that, but they took three elements of the value off to bring the budget down in order to create a figure. Now, that's what I was told when I first came in. I was asked not to look at the data, not to update the data, not to tell anybody about the true data, but really just use a top-level single figure that had already been accepted.
And you're listed as a whistleblower. Who did you start telling about this, and how did the organisation respond? Don't name individuals, but how did the organisation respond as you blew the whistle?
There's a number of governance meetings, as you'd expect. So there was a risk assessment. The risk element was run by senior executive, and the risk was there's not enough money in the budget. I explained it needed 3 times as much money in the budget. I was told, do not give those figures. The government civil servants sat next to me. I told them they were doing weekly reports. Please report to your minister and your seniors. We need 3 times as much money. I was told she would not do that. She refused. She would only stick to the official figures.
She wouldn't take it to the minister.
She would not take it.
Did you try getting the figures to the minister?
I did indeed. So there was 2 weekly boards, and I was giving my figures to those 2 weekly boards. That was showing 4.8 billion. That was taken as a draft. The day that I had to formally publish those, and that wouldn't become a draft, it'd become a formal document saying we needed 4.8 billion. Half an hour before I was due to give that to ministers and seniors, I was fired. All my work was deleted. It was never seen again.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much. Now, a spokesman for HS2 Limited said, Mr. Bruce's claims have been made multiple times in the media over the last 6 years, and we have dealt with them at considerable length. We will not be drawn on the same allegations again. While previously, HS2 has commented saying HS2 Limited denies Mr. Bruce's claims that the report produced by Deloitte was shredded or that he was sacked for being a whistleblower, instead alleging he was let go for poor performance. Mind you, it is worth noting that HS2 ran massively over budget, and therefore Rishi Sunak cancelled part of it. That's just something to bear in mind. But thank you very much again to Andrew. Shortly, after the messages from our sponsors, as a health report is released by the Wall Street Journal, should Biden